I went through the UCB improv thing.
Recently.
Yeah, the first 3 levels of that I wound up doing online because they weren't back in person yet.
Mm-hmm.
I was like...
Before I ask you more about UCB, I want to welcome everybody to AI Affected, the podcast that talks about AI and its effects on human beings, life, work, and relationships. My guest today is a former video effects engineer and experimental film director, just kind of a general surrealist, and also a former engineer at Verizon, one of my favorite human beings. It's Will Rosecrans. Welcome, Will.
Glad to be here. Thank you for the introduction.
Thanks for coming. So we were just talking about, this is kind of a residual of the pandemic phase of trying to find the fill for free time, even if you're working, but you're working from home, and so hence isolated from the other human beings, even after safety concerns have gone away for a long time.
Yeah, yeah, and it's not like there's no safety concerns now. It's not as severe as it once was.
But, well, now you're just expected to be a normal person and put everything to the back of your mind and take no precautions and act as if nothing has happened.
In fairness, I've been expected to be a normal person for about 40 years, and I've never lived up to that over the course of the last 40 years, so...
So I'm not going to start now, is what you're saying.
Yeah. I feel like I missed the bus on being a normal person a very long time ago.
So do you feel like there is any kind of residual anxiety about being in these kind of like public, bar spaces or going? I mean, does that? I know that you already have talked about experiencing some level of social anxiety. So is that compounded, or is that just? Yeah,
for me, so. Like I've always had a certain amount of social anxiety, and then started working remote, living alone in 2020, spending a lot of time by myself, and eventually developed tinnitus, which you know about, which meant it was really hard to sleep because I had a loud noise in my ear every night. So I was sort of just alone and exhausted, pacing back and forth in my apartment for a long time, and I went a little squirrely. So I started doing therapy at a certain point, which was helpful because, I literally just wasn't talking for days.
Is it in-person therapy, or is it therapy over Zoom?
Yeah, it's in person.
That's good.
I didn't really know anything about therapy or what kind of therapist I needed or anything, but I was like, I need to, get out of my house and go for a walk and talk to a person.
I think that was a good instinct, yeah.
And that has been helpful in starting to get some encouragement to get out and do things, because she'll sort of ask pointed questions like, so you're very lonely and feeling isolated. Have you gone out and done anything?
Have you attempted to not be isolated?
That's a really interesting strategy. I'll seriously consider planning something in the future. Not yet. But yeah, having gotten so out of the habit, it is hard to get back into it. There is a real inertia where once you get used to just being by yourself and not putting on pants, and you wake up and then it's 4 p.m. already and you lost a day, I have to schedule things. I have to talk to people. I need to wear pants. That's work now.
It's definitely a thing that atrophies. And then also, for people like you and me, and I'm sure that the degree might not be the same, but we've both experienced some level of social anxiety just in general. I remember pre-improv days, which I felt like made a huge difference in this field. I would, a comedian friend would invite me to a party, and I would be sitting there on the steps outside of the apartment where the party was going, taking deep breaths and psyching myself up and being like, right, be regular, be normal.
Oh, yeah.
As opposed to being keyed up and weird and anxiety ridden when I walked into, having to deal with all these people that I'd never met before.
Yeah, and for anybody who doesn't know you and I personally, you and I originally met taking improv classes at a theater that no longer exists. But yeah, my instincts have always been very introverted, so doing improv was a way to get training in talking to people.
I was going to ask about that, because for me it was I'm actually interested in comedy, but I'm kind of bored listening to myself do stand-up, and I want to learn more about this art form. But it is also effectively kind of a human training exercise.
Yeah, you were talking about being at a party. The social dynamics at a party are incredibly complex and difficult to analyze if that's the way your brain is approaching that situation.
I still hate it.
You see, the meme of the guy standing in the corner at a party. These people have no idea, and then, they'll fill in with whatever weird thing he's thinking about. That's very much me. Just going around analyzing the social situation, trying to understand it in a way that some people find intuitive. Mm-hmm. And, there's two people having a conversation. You're like, I shouldn't just be standing here in the corner. I need to talk to somebody in order to be doing this party correctly.
You're like, I'm aware of the problem.
So which two people am I going to try and interrupt? And what can I hear about their conversations that I think I would be most compatible with? And at an improv class, an improv teacher is like, you two get on stage and start talking to each other. I'm like, okay, great. The stress of choosing who to talk to has been taken away from me. And then that is a very comfortable thing to have some structure.
And once you get experienced in improv, hopefully in a good environment, you become aware that every person that could join you in a scene is trained in listening to you and helping you to develop each other's characters and recognize the environment around you. So they're there to help, as opposed to what someone with anxiety might assume is like, either a hostile or uninterested person. So why would I want to engage with them in the first place?
Yeah, it is very easy to project, at least for me. Oh, everybody else in the world is having this amazing time, and I'm not. Therefore, if I try and insert myself into them, I'll be a real, dragging their energy level down by my presence, and that sort of state feeds back on itself. Mm-hmm. And it's kind of like that inertia I was talking about, where if you are in that mode of, either literally or metaphorically stuck in the corner at the party, not sure, how to strike up a conversation with somebody, when you get your head about that, it supports itself. Mm-hmm. Because you're not talking to anybody. Nobody else is giving your brain input of words for you to focus on. You only have your own words to focus on. So if those are your own words, they will reinforce themselves inside your head.
It's a feedback mechanism, yeah.
Yeah.
In the first episode of this that we ever did, I was talking to, I don't know if you know Patrick Henry, but he wrote a book about dating for geeks, and so some of it was covering like, if you feel uncomfortable, here's what to do. But one of the things we were talking about was my experience as a teenager of being totally paralyzed when trying to talk to women specifically.
Sure.
Because it's like, I was raised by a single mom. Like, I'm aware that women are bothered all the time and that they get harassed. And I was like, well, why would I want to contribute to that? And then, but at the same time, someone has to advocate for you, going, well, like, you're a nice person, they might enjoy talking to you, rather than you just lumping yourself into just being another person that bothers women. But at the time, 15, 16, I was like, no, I'm not even going to approach them, because I don't want to be, contributing to the field of harassment.
Oh, yeah. When in doubt, err on the side of caution is often good advice. Mm-hmm. And as a person constantly full of doubt,
then you brought some caution with you.
Yeah, just never talk to anybody, and you'll never accidentally say something rude to somebody. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that fear of rejection thing is a powerful deterrent.
Yeah, and like for me, I wouldn't even necessarily phrase it in terms of rejection, though that was certainly a component of my thinking. Mm-hmm. Like the fear of making the world a worse place by my presence.
Wow.
As long as I never interrupt somebody, mm-hmm. I can never, like, oh, they're probably, they're thinking about something, they're having a day, good or bad. I cannot make their day worse if I never interrupt them.
This is the don't interact by default form of being a person.
It's I very much have that kind of computer programmer analytical mindset. If I have some idea, how do I scale up this idea to the most efficient, pure version of that idea? Mm-hmm. Which is sometimes professionally a very useful thought process. How do I make this code run faster? How do I deploy this to more servers? But then in a social context, if you have sort of a negative thought to start with, how do I scale up this negative thought to its most extreme form is not a useful approach.
That's true. And on the flip side of that, as basically an efficiency expert, which you are in a coding sense, you immediately gravitate toward, well, the most efficient, like, first of all, there is no efficient way to build human relationships because you have to stumble all over the place and be uncomfortable, and none of that is efficient. And so clearly the most efficient choice is to just not engage at all.
Yeah.
So you just finished up working for Verizon for many years.
Yeah, so The company / division I worked for went through a bunch of mergers and acquisitions over the years. So technically, I did not leave Verizon because they had sold off the division and then it got bought by somebody. It was very convoluted.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Because I know that you were kind of in a, like, when you were in the office, you were in this partitioned separate floor away from the regular Verizon people with your team, with your engineering team. Mm-hmm. And then that floor, could that get like bought and sold separately as piecemeal versus the rest of the office, or how was that working?
Yeah, basically it sort of became a joke of like, okay, who do we work for now? What executive has taken us over and given us a grand strategic direction that will never actually happen because they don't know what we really do, and they've just sort of gotten some buzzwords. So I worked for what was once a startup called Edgecast that got bought by Verizon. Verizon also bought AOL, so we got merged into AOL. Then Verizon bought Yahoo. So at that point, we didn't get merged into Yahoo per se. They merged Yahoo and AOL into a new company called Oath, which was a separate company but owned by Verizon. Mm-hmm. But then that eventually did get sold off as Yahoo, so eventually did wind up technically working for Yahoo. And then the content delivery unit that I was working for got bought by a different CDN called Limelight, which renamed itself to Edgio as part of the merger. That's the company I worked for.
I really love this because to me this is like almost a Charlie Kaufman-esque situation where it's like, you know that you have a job that you're supposed to show up to at certain times.
Through that half dozen companies I worked for, I mostly had the same desk.
Okay, that's good. That fixture.
I mostly had the same job. I wound up bouncing between a couple of related internal teams technically and had slightly different internal titles over the course of the 7 years I was there.
But it was also the case, right, that your team, it was either unclear or changing constantly, like who your team was reporting to and what your team was responsible for, kind of stuff, based on whatever new owner company came in and gave you different directives for what you guys should be doing?
Oh, yeah, it was, yes.
So you were kind of this free-floating mercenary unit that was thrown in between a bunch of different corporate shell companies. And the way that I remember you describing your job to me one time is that you were like a decoder. Like you would go in and remove extraneous code from various systems that were clogging up the works.
That was honestly a valuable part of what I did in a lot of cases. Because I can sort of talk about the complexity of modern tech stacks and things, but there is sort of an assumption that writing more code is always useful. And a lot of times, just deleting old code is really valuable. Because whenever you hear about there was this security vulnerability, there was some code that hackers were able to exploit to get some information. If you deleted that code, hackers couldn't exploit it. And
as opposed to implementing a brand new security protocol on top of the exploitable code or something.
Yeah, the more layers you add on top of stuff, it's impossible to understand the increasingly complex interactions between all of those things. And eventually you forget some old thing that was written in the startup days when everybody was just working through the night, caffeine-fueled, and there were only 3 employees and there were no standards on anything. And it was just a couple of grad students and nobody knew how anything works. When all of that old stuff still exists in this complex stack and you build layers and layers and layers on top of it, then you wind up with this, we have this totally new system. It does all of these amazing things. And then under the hood, it's still this janky old code from 10 or 20 or 30 years ago.
Is this a phenomenon? This occurs to me as a phenomenon of capitalism that it makes people nervous to state what you just stated, that we actually would be more efficient by removing this code rather than hiring a bunch of engineers and building a whole bunch of new things. Because presumably most people feel like they've been hired to produce code.
Code is presumed to be an asset at every corporation I have ever worked at or with or had friends working at, because it is a thing you pay people to create. So it logically fits into this concept of asset. If you are a company that makes chairs and you pay people to make chairs, you're like, oh, great, we've got all of these chairs. That is an asset that we can sell. When we go to get a bank loan, we can say we have a warehouse full of 1 million chairs And the bank will be like, okay, so worst case scenario, that is an asset that is on the balance sheet. In reality, I think code should always be understood as a liability on your balance sheet, not an asset.
Wow.
And almost nobody agrees with me.
No, engineers would be very mad at you for saying that.
A lot of engineers would appreciate it. All the bean counters would be like, why did we spend all of this money paying people to create something that is a negative value? But it is something that has to be maintained. It is something that has to be understood. It is something that you have to pay for servers to run all that old code. The less code you have, running at any moment, the fewer servers and the lower your operational costs, because if you are only running the code you really need to run, that's a lot cheaper to operate than running 10 times that much code for no reason.
So to use the previous analogy, you're the guy that walks into the chair warehouse and finds all of the basically booby-trapped chairs that weren't put together well, and you take them apart and you throw them into the fireplace and you go, look, I've saved you all this money on liability suits.
Yeah, that I think, ironically, has been one of the most valuable parts of my career. Yeah, is all the code that I was just like, I'm going to delete this. I don't think we need this anymore.
But that would indeed make the chair management very uncomfortable. To just what they thought was a warehouse full of assets is really a warehouse full of a few kind of ticking time bombs here and there, and they have to hire people to take them apart.
Yeah, we can just not pay rent for this warehouse.
I love that because it's both like it's minimalistic. It seems weirdly subversive and anti-capitalist from some point of view. And also just arguing that more code isn't better and that code is a liability. It almost is like, and by the way, your tech boom is over. Like the tech boom is ended. So we're not going to get infinite funding based on this. You actually have to run things efficiently and not just keep adding on top.
Yeah, like... there was a Twitter release recently about how they prioritize timeline stuff, and people were looking at how long that code takes to run, and people were really thinking about how many servers Twitter operates, and like the total global electricity supply, a significant percentage of that goes to servers run by large tech companies because they have so many processors and stuff going for that. The number of CPUs that Twitter uses to decide what tweets to show you is much larger than the number of CPUs in the largest supercomputer that the US government uses for nuclear bomb simulations.
Crazy.
By like orders of magnitude. And there are reasons for that. Supercomputers doing simulation stuff like that are doing kinds of different work. So there's limits to how big you can scale them because they all need to talk to each other more than what Twitter's doing. Like there's technical reasons why that would be true. But like the look on your face just now when I said that, it was counterintuitive that ordering tweets is a larger computational problem than nuclear bomb simulations.
Well, also something that occurred to me is if you want to talk about power consumption and waste in the news, the big argument has been about crypto, which is that people hate proof of work crypto systems because you're basically running supercomputers and computer clusters like 24/7 trying to solve these mathematical equations that unlock cryptocurrency rewards. And everyone's like, this is a waste. We have a finite planet. Like, we don't need Bitcoin. It doesn't provide any value. And I always, as somebody who, granted, full disclosure, is generally in favor of crypto, perhaps as an outlet for when like traditional economies collapse, I was like, well, what about like Call of Duty? Like, how many millions and millions of people are playing Call of Duty? Like, what is the resource cost? What is the energy cost? Why is nobody angry about that? That doesn't seem to productively add to society that we're running all of these machines doing that. And then you've just brought up like probably an even better example of that.
Yeah, there was Microsoft released a firmware update for recent models of Xboxes where it would go to sleep and waste less power. And like it actually wound up being a news blurb where Fox was like, Microsoft is going woke and they're trying to get this PR for saving energy because they want to seem green. But like genuinely, there are so many millions of Xboxes, and at peak, each one is using hundreds of watts. I don't know the exact number, but yeah, hundreds of millions of things times hundreds of watts is gigawatts of power being consumed by home video game consoles, plus also the TVs, also potentially a couple hundred watts. So you're talking about multiple nuclear reactors worth of energy running 24/7, running PlayStations and Xboxes and stuff like that.
That aren't even being used at the time necessarily.
I mean, Yeah, if they're just kind of left on burning a certain amount of power, yeah, which is why Microsoft was like, oh, we can, if it's not in use, we can just have it go to sleep and use less power.
Yes, very much your style of adaptation and change. This is also interesting to me. Not just the waste of power and how we allocate resources, but the mind share of like how many people right now on the internet are actively angry about people advocating for crypto when they feel like crypto is a burden on the environment, versus how many people right now are angry about the fact that there's inefficient code in some number of databases that is just wasting gigabytes of power, and it's just not in anyone's mind share at all.
Yeah, I mean, you're angry at what you can see. Mm-hmm. I mean, I've never been to a Twitter data center. I'm believing things I have read on the internet about the scale of them. It's possible I'm wrong, you know. That is not a set of numbers I can individually verify, and attempting to verify would require flying around the world to a bunch of random data centers and things to try and estimate their size.
Oh, sure. But given that you're an expert in this, like, we can assume, and we're talking about not just Twitter, but just, who knows, smart appliances, you know, these things that are built on bad code that are just consuming unnecessary amounts of energy.
It's also off the radar when it's not visible. The crypto stuff, there were a bunch of really annoying tech bros who really wanted to talk to you about crypto all the time for a little while, because it was one of those things that went through a hype cycle. It was a weird, obscure nerd hobby for a couple of years, and then, you know, the finance guys kind of found out about it, and then it became a very mainstream topic of conversation for a couple of years. And so it was on people's radar. Mm-hmm. It is a significant consumer of power, and it is a reason to be concerned. It is certainly not the only thing, and it is not necessarily the only thing you would focus on if you were worried about global power consumption. If you were starting from, let's rationally sort of just analyze a bunch of industries and see what's using power and see what's using the dirtiest power and seeing what we can have the biggest effect on, it was what people were talking about. Therefore, it was what was on the radar.
I mean, do you think beyond the very old school ideas of like the little e-sticker, the energy efficiency thing that we put on appliances, that like there's any awareness on the government level of this phenomenon, and like, should we assemble a council of people to go, you know, we're wasting energy in these fields where there's things running on poor code, things running inefficiently, the transmission lines are losing X%. Like, who is responsible for all of this stuff?
So there are a ton of very smart people who work for the government who know all of that stuff. Mm-hmm. Those people have no power. They all work for people who don't understand those things, because there's, you know, a layer of political appointees hiring management people, and the management people don't necessarily appreciate the scale of some of the problems that they're dealing with. At one point, Rick Scott was running the Department of Energy. He did not know what the Department of Energy did. Among other things, they're responsible for nuclear weapons, which are our most energetic devices, in kind of a euphemistic way. And he wound up running that whole organization that, in addition to things like nukes, is responsible for, you mentioned, like power line losses. Those are significant. They're also something that are a niche topic that people who don't pay attention to that sort of thing don't think about every day. Depending on where you live, your power lines may be buried. You may not even see the power lines. If you do see them, you aren't necessarily thinking about how much energy they're losing.
Have you devoted any thought to, because I'm going to gently steer this toward AI for a second, or at least algorithms. Any thought to, so we're talking about, you know, things that are in the mind share, things that people actively get angry about versus problems that might be equal in size that they have no idea about. And I think part of this, you would think, is driven by filter bubbles, and, you know, a news story becomes popular, it spreads throughout a populace, everyone becomes aware of it. And then the flip side of that, excuse me, is that something like what you're talking about, like let's say the loss of energy via power line transmission, is something that nobody cares about, is not a major news story, is not part of mindshare, could potentially be a huge solution to an energy efficiency problem, but the filter bubbles and the algorithms are kind of preventing those things from competing with those other stories.
Yeah, one question I've seen recently pop up is, I'm hearing about all of these train derailments recently. Is that like Russian spies are sabotaging them? And you're hearing about more train derailments recently because they've been in the news. trains derail all the time. The system is incredibly dangerous. There are thousands of major train safety incidents every year in America. You just haven't been paying attention to them until recently because of the Ohio train derailment. That was very dangerous and had a very specific, large impact in one specific place. But the thousands of other train safety issues over the past year collectively are probably just as disruptive. Any individual one just wasn't as large, so it didn't make the news, so it wasn't on the radar.
So is this a fault of just we can't be aware of everything all the time, or does some of this responsibility go to the recommendation engines, which is like, oh, do you like this? Do you want more of this thing that you like? As opposed to, you like this? Well, here's something that you might not have stated that you like, but might be important.
All of the above. So the issue definitely existed before the modern algorithmically driven filter bubbles, which are a big problem, because something like power line law, no news organization is going to go send a journalist to a power line to be like, it's continuing to lose as much power as it did yesterday. That's the news, because it's not news. And human beings care about recent things. They care about changes that they have noticed. And they care about changes that are concentrated in a very specific, impactful place. Humans are very bad at understanding diffuse, broad, underlying systemic issues that are kind of at the noise floor, that are very distributed, that exist everywhere, but aren't currently affecting you personally in a way that is actively causing you unusual pain right now, or you can't see on the news. That something is causing that pain to somebody that you can see and empathize with.
Sure. A good example of this would be the Fukushima plant, which, as far as I know, is still leaking radioactive material into the ocean. But, they've just said, well, that's ambient radiation now, and it'll disperse, and that's, all we can do about it.
I would actually, I think my takeaway from Fukushima would be a little bit different from you, because people found a nuclear reactor a scary thing. Thousands and thousands of people died in the earthquake. Nobody has provably died from the Fukushima nuclear reactor. It's possible that there will be some calculable number of additional cancers because of the radiation that got released, but it's much, much, much smaller than the people who died in the earthquake. But people found the concept of nuclear scarier. Nobody remembers the Tohoku earthquake. I don't remember if it was the Tohoku earthquake or if that's a completely different earthquake off the top of my head. I know Tohoku was an earthquake in Japan, but now that I think about that, it may have been a completely different one.
Well, I mean, we're asking you to remember a news story from before the event, so anything before then is a little hazy.
But earthquakes are a thing that happen. We don't really think about it that much. That's natural. Earthquakes have happened for thousands of years. But nuclear reactors sound scary. So you and I both know the Fukushima nuclear power plant, but the amount of radiation it released is very small.
Yeah, I think some component of that, though, is that it was a local news, like the earthquake was a major story in Japan and then less so internationally. But then if there's this perceived effect on international waters, then that makes it more of a news story for everybody else kind of thing.
Yeah, and that bias of how does this affect me personally? Oh, the ocean, the fish, theoretically radiation could reach here through the Pacific, even though it would be so small that you could measure it, but it wouldn't necessarily have any effect. That is totally a part of the inherent human filter bubble, which is multiplied by the modern algorithmic filter bubble that we're all kind of living in, where whenever you are trying to optimize for the wrong thing, you're going to be really successful at something terrible. And that is what all the social media companies are doing. They want to optimize for engagement. They don't want to optimize for people knowing how the world works.
I love you being the spokesperson against engagement as a viable optimization thing. It seems like I get your point, and I think you're right, but it also seems fitting that you should be like, just chill out on the engagement as an endpoint.
Well, yeah, but when managers show up in the conference room and are like, you'll get a bonus if you make this number go up, then engineers are going to try and make that number go up. And that is what happens in all of those tech companies that are related to social media kinds of things, because the more people are looking at the site, the more opportunity you have to show them ads, and the more engagement they are doing with content, the more information you have about that person and a profile that you can build about things they like, things they dislike, which means you can charge more to advertisers for ad targeting. You can say, this person hates the environment, this person loves the environment. They don't care about you knowing facts about the environment. They care about the fact that, an oil company that wants to do PR ads to make you love the oil company can target specific profiles. And the more you engage, the more information they have on you and the more ads they can show you.
So a couple times now you've talked about these sort of perverse incentives that are inherent to certain corporate structures. So for instance, the idea that code is an asset and we don't want to look too close at it because then we might discover that there are all these hidden liabilities and time bombs. The notion that engagement is good wherein it, obviously has its negative effects on the human populace. Where do you think these perverse incentives will take us in terms of like the development of AI and ChatGPT and things like that?
Yeah, that's a good and scary question. Because the fact that humans operate consistent with the incentives that they experience is not new. That is the way human beings have always worked. If you say, I will pay you for X, then the human being is more likely to do X. In the context of AI, you can very directly sort of say, I want to train an AI to do X, and the AI will not be a little more likely to do that. The AI will do exactly that, totally oblivious to any sort of broader social harms or consequences or anything like that. And engineers are not great at worrying about social harms or broader consequences. But it's at least possible that an engineer will stand up in a meeting and be like, this is a terrible idea.
Have you ever seen that in person?
Yes.
And without talking about the specifics of the person or anything like that, like what were the potential terrible consequences that they thought that it was important enough to jeopardize their position at a meeting to call out to management?
I used to work at a large content delivery network, and network neutrality is one of the things that was very much on the radar of people working kind of in the internet infrastructure industry. And we were what had been a startup that was owned by a large telecom that had a legacy telecom approach of, we want you to use our network. Our network is our product. We want our network to do well. And, they had that incentive. And when senior people would sort of come to us and say some fairly empty things about, sure, we support net neutrality, or we support net neutrality as defined as, or things, I saw guys just stand up and walk out of the meeting. Engineers are not all people. So the one sort of counterpoint that is good about the tech industry is, while engineers may be sort of very laser focused on a technical problem that they are working on, and they aren't necessarily great at thinking about social harms and issues to society, when they are convinced that they are right, they don't particularly care about annoying somebody with that opinion. That part of working in the tech industry was something I really did like. If somebody was like, hey, this is wrong because X, saying that out loud was always very supported.
Where did we settle out on net neutrality? Is that still a principle that's upheld, or do we have a bunch of other perverse incentives that are prioritizing certain websites and deprioritizing other things? Because that's also a debate I have not heard about in years and years. So I assume very naively that we won, and that net neutrality is still the guiding principle of the internet, and that everyone has to be treated relatively the same, and that you can't throttle the internet speed on websites that you don't want people to go to. But is that really true?
Russ, I love you like a brother. That is the dumbest assumption I've ever heard.
Great.
There are many parts of the internet that are operated in a very neutral way, in a very dispassionate way, in a non-profit oriented way. That is not true of all parts of the internet. There are large companies with large profit motives to make non-neutral choices in how traffic gets routed.
Example.
The buzzword in the wireless industry is zero rating. When you get a wireless plan, they'll say comes with 10 gigabytes of high-speed data per month, right? Certain services just don't count towards that 10 gigabyte cap, which as an end customer, you're kind of going, oh, well, I like things not counting towards my cap. Like, that is presented as a thing that is good for you, but also that 10 gigabyte cap doesn't need to exist. It's a completely sort of arbitrary business choice rather than a technical choice.
So this example also just occurred to me now that we're talking about this. So like when I'm flying on, let's say, American Airlines, and they have the Wi-Fi on the plane, they're going to charge you, whatever, $30 if you want to use general Wi-Fi. But they're like, or you could just browse our partner Zara and do shopping on Zara for free. And that I guess is a violation of net neutrality.
Yeah, that is totally by definition non-neutral. Operating a live internet feed to an airplane moving hundreds of miles an hour in the sky is a hard and expensive thing to do. So, like, it's not shocking that that would be done in a very managed lockdown kind of way. But also, yeah, it is not neutral, and an airline is not necessarily who you go to for a shining example of network neutrality. That's a part of the modern internet, for better or worse.
I want to go back to the discussion about isolation that we had earlier in the show. So, this is something that we probably both struggled with before the internet age, even when we were teenagers, and it wasn't as prevalent, or maybe there were just some AOL chat rooms and stuff that were more of a novelty than something that was all kind of pervasive in your life. Since then, and now there's definitely talking about incentive structures. There's definitely an incentive to be, whether you're working or not, to be in front of the screen more often and to be influenced by social media filter bubbles more often. Does this make the isolation / trying to interact with human beings problem, like, how much harder is it to solve now that we're in this setting?
It's definitely harder. When my father was a young man in, the 1970s watching television, there were 3 channels and they all had basically the same news. My father was a hippie, but when he was in the South talking to conservative people, as much as he would politically disagree with people, he had the same basic understanding of reality as the people that he talked to. Mm-hmm. And he was able to navigate those social spaces in a way that no longer exists. Because of the modern filter bubbles, people have fundamentally different understandings of how the world works, what is going on, what is happening, what is important. And yeah, when you and I live in Los Angeles, that is a geographic filter bubble in a sense. This is understood stereotypically, but somewhat accurately, to be a, blue state, left-leaning kind of place where if I go into a social situation with somebody I don't know and I'm talking to an actor who works in Hollywood, and I say, I don't particularly like Trump, that's likely to be a very uncontroversial thing here.
Yeah. You can predict a lot of their opinions pretty easily.
There's a chance that you can get into a conversation with somebody and they just have a fundamentally different understanding about the problems that are facing America, what is happening, who the president is, why the former president is being indicted. Those filter bubbles in the context, not only because of algorithmic filtering of feeds and things, but multiplied enormously by that, have put us in a situation. Obama always used to like to say, there are not 2 Americas. And it resonated in campaign speeches, but I was like, that's ridiculous. Mm-hmm. There are many very separate, quote unquote nations within these geographical borders of the United States of America, certainly at least 2. And that does make it much harder to connect with people. And one thing I've seen as we are recording this, former President Trump has recently been indicted. And one of the things I've seen on Twitter is people going, if they can do this to him, they can do this to you. And they think they are making an argument that will resonate with liberals. Mm-hmm. And they're not at all, because the bubbles are so separate. All the liberals are like, yes, we've been saying for many years that we want the rule of law to be universally applied, including to powerful people. Mm-hmm. And the conservatives who are sort of saying, even this person, also you would be subject to the same thing. Their baseline of what they are arguing is so different from the way I understand basic concepts like the rule of law. I'm like, I don't even really understand what you're arguing in order to try and convince me that you're right. Mm-hmm. So it does not resonate, and it is not a foundation for engaging in a conversation to get mutual understanding.
Well, isn't part of that though? Like, granted that the filter bubbles have caused this like massive divergence where people are further away from each other. But isn't it also the case that it used to be more normal to talk to somebody with a different political outlook than you? That you would just walk around with the assumption that certain people are libertarians and certain people are conservatives and certain people are liberal and certain people are anarchists. And I can have a conversation. I don't have to agree with them, but I can have a conversation with them. But that seems to have gone away.
Yeah, and that is not specifically the fault of algorithmic filtering of feeds, but algorithmic filtering of feeds has multiplied and accelerated that effect in the context where there are also a lot of socio-political things pushing in that direction as well at the same time. And, you know, when you have balanced forces, something doesn't move. Algorithmic filtering is one of the forces that is pushing us away, but all of those forces pushing us away from each other are, broadly speaking, pointing in the same direction now in a way that they were not 20, 30, 40 years ago.
When you were talking about Two Americas, I read, I'm trying to remember the name of Neil Stephenson's book. I think it's called, there's a title, and then the alternate title is Dodge in Hell, where most of the book is like talks about a digital afterlife where people are uploading their consciousness into what is ostensibly like a Minecraft universe, and the souls that show up in the afterlife are like building the whatever they want to call it, heaven or hell or whatever it is, from scratch. And it turns out that Dodge, who's an engineer and a character in a former Neil Stephenson book, he's like the first soul there, so he just starts. He regains self-awareness and he starts building the world around him. And then, other than like the entire world being completely transfixed as they're digitally watching this like a show, the afterlife come into being. But meanwhile, in the real world, America, this is like maybe 10, 15 years in the future, has separated into two completely different nations where, you know, if you're driving in a not a major city, you're in the whatever you want to call it, like the red zone, where everything is like biblical law and, you know, people and they're different regulations. Is this prophetic? Are we headed there?
So there's two halves to that, the sort of real world and the virtual world. As far as the virtual world part of it, some people absolutely believe mind uploading is going to be practical within our lifetimes. I don't know that that's true. I can't prove that it's not true. Mark Zuckerberg apparently is someone who is very, if not convinced of it, convinced of the possibility of it.
Oh, Mark Zuckerberg's on a quest for immortality? Who would have guessed that?
Well, people sort of made fun of him. Oh, I'm rebranding Facebook to Meta, and it's all going to be about the metaverse. And everyone is like, we don't want to go to work in 3D and just send emails on my... Most people didn't understand what he was trying to do and why he was so excited about that, because he's in his own filter bubble. Mark Zuckerberg thinks mind uploading is possible, and he's building himself a heaven using Facebook engineers. That's what Meta is. That's what the metaverse is ultimately in the long-term plan for him.
I think he had to lay off a bunch of those metaverse engineers recently.
Yeah, it didn't really... Like I said, he was in a filter bubble of his own where he thought he could just say, build me a heaven.
Yeah.
And he was very wrong about that. No, they weren't able to build him a heaven. But yeah, he genuinely thinks he was using his billions of dollars so that he could become an eternal god. I mean that in a very literal way.
Which is amazing, because there's an antagonist in the book that I'm talking about who is cut from the same cloth. He's like a tech billionaire who goes into the afterlife with like I don't know how this happens, whether he has a bunch of his subordinates like kill themselves at the same time and digitally upload themselves so that when he transports into the afterlife, he has a whole cadre of supporters with him, and he gives himself godlike powers within the afterlife so that he can take it over from Dodge, the original like creator of the afterlife.
And like, to go back to a thing we were talking about at the beginning of the conversation, assuming that we do build digital heaven for ourselves and an eternal afterlife to be simulated with mind uploading, under the hood, the basic code making all of that work is going to be using 50-year-old APIs. Like, the basic design of Unix APIs dates to the 1970s, and that's still under the hood how Linux presents how you read and write files, and there's going to be files on disks for heaven. And, you're going to use an open syscall and then a read syscall. And if a engineer from the 1970s woke up from cryogenic freezing to work on a Linux server in the year 2050 to maintain that metaverse for uploaded minds, there's a lot of the top layers that he'd be like, this is insane and I don't understand any of it. But then like all the stuff under the hood of how the operating system actually works, we're like, oh, okay, you still have files have names, there's streams of bytes, all that beyond the sexy stuff is unchanging.
You make it sound as though the modern internet has like an 8-deck, like a cassette tape player, like underneath all of the fancy bells and whistles. Like, yeah,
IPv4 dates to the early 80s. There was an assumption that we were all going to upgrade to IPv6, and we kind of haven't because of inertia. The internet is the internet of the 1980s with a lot of glue put on it because billions of people use it. It's really hard to upgrade anything that billions of people are using because you need to maintain backwards compatibility.
So given that you're like a very strangely a niche expert in this anachronistic, outdated technology that our entire internet and communications platform runs on, is this, I mean, one would think, and like me as a layperson without knowing anything about the technical aspects of this, that some of this would be like super exploitable stuff in the future, given that it's not made with, that underneath the modern security protocols, there's an 8-deck player underneath.
I mean, that has sort of been the last 20 years of internet security. Yeah, like there have been a bunch of iOS security issues that turned out to be because of the code for reading images. That back in the 90s, somebody wrote some code that would read an image and everybody just kept using it and wasn't that changed. It would get fixes as people noticed issues, but it wasn't written to modern standards. And then, that code predates the concept of an iPhone. It predates the concept of a smartphone. But it would still get used when somebody would send a animated GIF meme image in an iMessage. And it was never written for that context, but it was the most convenient way to decode an animated GIF image because the animated GIF format dates back to the 1980s. So the code from the 1990s is the new code for dealing with animated GIFs. That's not the original code. That's, the modernized stuff. And then, yeah, of course it had bugs. Because when it was originally running on computers that ran DOS that weren't connected to a network, nobody cared about privilege escalation exploits and stuff like that because DOS computers didn't have multiple users. They didn't have security.
So, and I'm going to go back to my efficiency question. Is there a governing body other than maybe some altruistic coders who are on GitHub or something like that? Like, is there a repository or a governing body going, hey, everyone, the whole internet and these major telecom companies are running their software on this old rickety Dodge Dart from 1977. Like, should we collectively do something about that?
There's a couple of things. If you ever listen to the Lawfare podcast, they have lots of like national policy and national security kinds of people on that podcast, and they occasionally try and talk to tech people about this kind of stuff. And from that perspective, they do talk somewhat about like liability legislation. An analogy they came up with recently was building codes for the internet, where if you build a building that meets building codes, you won't be sued if it burns down because you followed the rules.
Right.
And if you don't follow building codes, then you have liability issues. That doesn't really exist. There is PCI, the payment card industry rules. If you do commerce on the internet, you'll get security audits and things. But the rules are stuff like, if the vendor for this software has issued a patch, you need to have installed it in a certain amount of time. For all the bugs that nobody knows about yet, because they're sitting in this old code base that people barely even remember is in use, nobody's sort of forcing proactive digital archaeology projects to figure that stuff out. there was a thing about video decoding I saw recently. In modern web browsers, like in Chrome development, there's a rule of 3 thing where you shouldn't do all 3 of running privileged code, running code written in a super low-level language that is really easy to write dangerous bugs, and code that is taking untrusted input like a file that you have downloaded from the internet that you don't control. You should not do all of those 3 things at the same time if you want to write a secure system. But video decoding, if you watch a video from the internet, that probably goes to a special chip or a special accelerator on some other chip in your computer. So there's some driver software that is written in a low-level language that is easy to write bugs in because it has to talk to this obscure piece of hardware. It has to be privileged because it needs to have permissions to talk directly to hardware. And it is taking untrusted input directly from the internet if you are downloading a video file and sending it to this decoder chip to play back on your computer. It's sort of a fundamentally unsolvable problem to have video playback that is like terrifyingly dangerous. Like whatever rules you build.
So you're saying video could be easily used as a Trojan horse to wreck somebody's system / video card, etc.
It's an area of active security research, yeah. And the rules that exist sort of don't apply to the practical reality of what you need to do in order to do that in code in the real world. Like you can come up with rules, you can tell people they have to follow those rules, but at a certain point, people have to write code that works, and they're going to use existing off-the-shelf tools in order to accomplish that.
Speaking of video, and before we run out of time, I did want to ask you about your career as an experimental film director.
Okay.
I worked with you on a UCLA student film called My Dinner with Megatron. Was this just a fun concept, or were you really inspired by My Dinner with Andre, the early 1980s film?
So I was taking film classes at UCLA, sort of on a little gap from having a day job. They have a summer program there that is shorter than the full degree course, and we had watched, not all of, but a part of My Dinner with Andre, which is a artsy film that only film nerds love. Normal people will find it incredibly boring because it's just 2 guys sitting down having dinner and talking about their life and the experience of being human and catching up. Sort of like I haven't had a conversation like this with you in some years.
It's very unusual. You kind of need the podcast set up an apparatus to facilitate like an in-depth conversation with the person these days.
And while I was taking a class at UCLA, a Transformers movie came out, and we were talking in class about, I had previously worked professionally in visual effects. I find it a very interesting subject, but at a certain point, I'm like, okay, it's sort of exhausting to watch robots punch each other. It became less interesting to me over time. And I was like, wouldn't it be great if like they did a Transformers movie, but like it was a little more character focused, and
they just had a conversation about the nature of like robot sentience and their identities.
And and because of the timing of watching in class and talking about the movie that had just come out in class, it became the topic of my short film of like, what if you took these ridiculous heightened cartoon characters made to sell toys and had them just like sit down and go, oh man, the concept of transforming and taking other forms as a robot is a really interesting thing that I never really explored philosophically. And it was just sort of the exact opposite of a Transformers movie. I had you dress up in a ridiculous cardboard costume as Megatron, gesturing theatrically about the experience of transformation and how that was metaphorically like...
Well, I enjoyed working on that in the... was I in the Megatron suit? No, I was in the Optimus Prime suit.
You were Megatron, and our friend Nicole was Optimus Prime.
I'd never spent so much time in a set of cardboard boxes in my life, and it was like almost like a Zen-like exercise in being uncomfortable. While everyone takes in that visual of me living in Megatron-shaped cardboard boxes, I'm going to read this promo really quickly for the studio that's been gracious enough to give us their time and their setup. So this is a script that has been, my understanding, has been generated by ChatGPT. for another program that they record here, where they're literally writing a movie script based on a bunch of actors spitballing like what kind of scenes they'd like to be in, and then they have ChatGPT write the dialogue for them. So I'm going to read this part of the script. So it's Interior, Beverly Hills 90211 Studios, day. Russ, the podcast host, is promoting Sharby to the audience. He explains the tokenomics and potential growth of the Beverly Hills 90211 Studios, also mentioning the producer's ownership of 300 million Sharby tokens. Go get some Sharby tokens. Ladies and gentlemen, let me introduce you to Sharby, a groundbreaking cryptocurrency with a unique approach to tokenomics. What sets Sharby apart is that it provides USDC rewards on every trading transaction, making it an ideal investment for those seeking a passive income source. Now, our producer is a firm believer in Sharby's potential and owns a whopping 300 million Sharby token. It sounds like a lot of Sharby tokens. Imagine the possibilities when Sharby's value rises. The growth and expansion of our Beverly Hills 90211 studios would be unstoppable. As Sharby continues to evolve with multi-chain compatibility and engaged growing community, its potential for success is truly limitless. By investing in Sharby, you're not only diversifying your portfolio, but also supporting our beloved Beverly Hills 90211 studios, which includes AI Affected, the show that we've been hosting in 90211 studios. So, if you're excited about Sharby and its unique tokenomics, consider joining our producer and countless others in the Sharby community. Let's build a future together. And a quick AI-affected disclaimer. Please note that investing in cryptocurrencies, including Sharby, carries risks. The opinions expressed here are those of the podcast host and do not constitute financial advice, nor am I a licensed financial advisor. Also, do your research and consult a financial professional before making investment decisions. The producer's ownership of 300 million Sharby tokens should be considered when evaluating the information presented. And also, please consider any energy usage on the servers that are generating that cryptocurrency and our relevant discussion. Will, do you want to promote, before we get out, do you want to promote your new experimental film that you're doing?
So I am working on a film project right now, but it doesn't have a title yet, and I need to come up with a title so I can start promoting
That helps to sell it, yeah.
The working title that I started with was Untitled Most Practical Time Travel Zombie Project, and it's going to be my first feature. We've almost got cast. I've got some crew. We haven't shot it yet, but it is basically the story of a time traveler who grew up in the post-apocalyptic wasteland in tunnels under the ruins of Los Angeles, and is going to go back in time with a giant bomb in order to change history and sort of save the world from the zombie apocalypse when it was happening. And she gets in the time travel machine, and when she pops out, everything is fine, and she realizes that a better time traveler has already saved the world, and she's just sort of stuck in the present with a doomsday weapon, and she needs to get a day job. So she starts working at a coffee shop, and she's just very sad and upset about having been robbed of her opportunity to save the world.
It's like time traveler problems that you don't often hear about.
Yeah, and it's just her being sad and like expressing grief at missing all the people she left behind, and ranting about being subject to capitalism, and realizing that like maybe being stuck in tunnels after the apocalypse, running away from zombies, was better than having a day job. It's very much inspired by being a tech guy having a midlife crisis, hitting 40, going, oh man, I'm in this like totally different time now where I feel like my skill set no longer applies. You know, in the real world, my life has been going forward in time rather than backwards, but it's a little more fun to play with it in a heightened sort of silly way with a backwards time travel in a more absurd scenario.
Well, I really enjoy and I look forward to your explorations of the mundanity of potential action settings, because I think that's something that you like super excel in is like being like, as a video effects engineer who's been engineering explosions for X years, I really enjoy the quiet moments when the action hero is just sitting there thinking about all of their life regrets instead of blowing things up.
The project I'm working on is all about like, I sort of pitched it as this setup for the Terminator, but if Kyle Reese wound up in Clerks. Mm-hmm. It's just like, I'm not even supposed to be here today. Like, genuinely not supposed to be here today. There's a problem with time travel.
Yeah, especially if you don't have that two-way time
Yeah.
travel.
Yeah,
The one-way time travel is not a good system.
Yeah, we are all stuck in the present. We just have to kind of make the best of it with the people we have here.
Well, thank you for time traveling approximately an hour into the future in the vehicle of this podcast. This has been AI Affected, and we will see you next time.
Woo!
I was going to go down a whole rabbit hole and ask you about My Dinner with Andre stuff, because I just read Andre Gregory just wrote his memoir, which is called This Is Not My Memoir. He's like 86 now. It turns out everything in My Dinner with Andre is all just him telling true stories about his life, and that Wallace Shawn was just his writing partner who would just collect all the stories and decided which ones were fit to be in the movie. So it's all true from his perspective anyway. And yeah, he, that whole thing about the famous line from My Dinner with Andre, where he's like, New York City has become a prison for, everyone who lives there, and the people who live there are also the guards and also the prisoners at the same time.
Yeah, and in the original My Dinner with Andre, he talked a lot about people are acting like robots. Which is why it was such a obvious thing. I can just steal a bunch of this dialogue verbatim for writing my student film.
People are robotic. They don't look at each other over the dinner table anymore.
Yeah, and that was all before smartphones and Twitter and stuff. And
that's true. That was a good long time ago already when we did that.
Yeah, that's one of those movies that weirdly is more relevant than the time it was made for. Yeah, it's funny watching some old Star Trek episodes and stuff. When things were science fiction, they were sort of talking about an idea this. At the time, that was just a weird sci-fi episode that didn't really resonate. But 20, 30 years later,
that happens.
Yeah, now it's spot on. Yeah, this was fun.
Cool. Yeah, thanks for joining me. I feel like we probably could have gone longer, but we're coming up on the next time slot.
We're still on.
Oh.
Talk a little bit about meme coins. What is that? What is that? I put the money hoping that it's gonna be 1,000x, but is that even possible?
Meme coins. So the OG meme coins would be, I think Dogecoin would be the poster child for meme coins, which was originally created as a joke on Reddit and then became an active Reddit currency that people would use to, tip each other for funny comments or make bets or something like that.
Yeah, and it was originally created sort of with this idea of look how easy it is to create one of these coins. Lots of people out on the internet are creating something and then hyping it up as a scam, and then it grew enormously in value because people found it amusing. And it's very difficult to predict what people value because most cryptocurrency is not useful as currency because it is so volatile, but it has become a thing people will spend money on, sort of independent of the traditional concepts of value,
Yeah, I worked with, speaking of a couple of the use cases of this stuff, I worked for a company briefly called Rally.io, which was a creator coin minter. So this was mostly for Twitch gamers and people who stream games. Is you have your monetization streams on Twitch, whereas you can run commercials on your stream, or you can have people pay for various activities. And Rally was or you can mint your own cryptocurrency in your own name, so you can be Gamer Girl coin, and if you get Gamer Girl coin, if you're watching the stream, you get allocated a certain amount, and then you can use it to buy swag from the streamer or trade with other people. And then if she gets more popular as a host and as a Twitch streamer, then theoretically the token becomes more valuable over time.
Yeah, artisanal Disney dollars. And we talk about concepts like the attention economy now. And that is kind of a very literal thing. There is value to being seen.
I had one of my many startup ideas that I never followed through on was a stock market for video acceleration, video views. So in other words, you would find a video that maybe hadn't been seen if you feel like you're someone who can spot these sort of things. And then you make a bet on it by buying stocks in this YouTube URL.
Oh.
And then depending on the acceleration curve of the views, then your stock would go up and you might have, more, and then you could spend it on some other viral thing later on. I always thought it was a good idea.
That is interesting. Yeah, just sort of taking a wisdom of the crowds.
Yeah, I mean, they have it for various. Obviously, there's sports betting has exploded, and you can bet on, what politician's going to win the primary if you go to the right place.
Yeah.
It was funny. My uncle had like a very clear idea that, what was her name? Susan Rice was going to be picked as the VP candidate for Biden.
Oh.
She was like the second, most popular choice or something like that. But he had some theoretically insider information where he's like, I think it's going to be Susan Rice. Where can we bet on this? And he had me call like the sports book at Caesar's Palace being like, can I bet on this? They're like, no, we don't. You can't bet on political candidates. We don't do that. And I'm like, really? They're like, I think we did it for a bit. But yeah, it's, in some cases, if you're a specialist in this stuff, it could be more interesting than gambling on, on equities or something like that.
Yeah, and any aspect of human activity can be understood through an economic lens in a very literal way. So sort of putting, all right, if you really think this is what's going to win the election or viral videos or whatever, put up or shut up, is a very efficient way to, figure out how much people really mean what they say.
Yeah. Immanuel Kant actually argued for that. He was famous for, he probably hung out with a bunch of German philosophers and was just bored out of his mind with them shooting their theories at each other and telling, what was good and what was bad. And he was just like a fan of, there is a way to settle this. If we put money down, then not only does it settle it, but he argued that it makes people less confident in their own position when they're forced with the decision of having to put money on something, that they become a more reasonable person, they become a little bit risk averse, and they go, oh, maybe I should actually think about my level of confidence in what I'm saying rather than just think that everyone else is an idiot and that I'm the correct one. And so it actually it's a good ego regulator also.
Yeah, opinions by default are free, and there are many of them. When there is a cost to your opinion, you're going to make an assessment about, is this real? Is this something I am genuinely convinced of? Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I got into an argument on the New York Knicks subreddit last week where Julius Randle, who's their lone all-star and their star player, just sprained his ankle, and it looked really bad. And the Knicks PR department was like, he'll be reevaluated in 2 weeks. The playoffs start in approximately 2 weeks, and everyone's like, he'll be fine. And I'm like, he is not playing in the first round of the playoffs. Have you ever seen a severely sprained ankle? Like, that's 4 weeks plus. Being reevaluated does not mean they're going to throw him on a basketball court after 2 weeks. And everyone's like, oh, what do you know? You're not a doctor because you sprained your ankle in college playing pickup. You think you have information? I'm like, put down $20 right now. And then everyone's like, whoa, hold on. We're just talking.
Yeah, my dad once sprained his ankle really badly. I probably told you this story at one point, but he was at work and fell like 6 inches off a deck, but rolled on his ankle just wrong. And so his right ankle was covered under workman's comp. So he had to commute from Denver to Boulder, Colorado to go to the doctor in Boulder that was covered by the employer in Boulder. He got in a car crash driving to his doctor.
God.
And when you get in a car crash, if you've got your foot on the brake really hard, when that impact happens, the impact goes into your foot. So he broke his left foot in his car.
So he was driving with his good foot, not his sprained foot.
Uh-huh.
Oh, no.
So then I wound up having to drive him to doctor's appointments. I had to drive him to Boulder for his right foot, and then I had to drive him to a doctor in Denver for his left foot because they were covered by different insurances.
Oh man, talk about inefficiencies! Holy moly!
Yeah, but the right one took a lot longer to heal. But
the sprained one took longer to heal than the broken one?
Yes. People underestimate how bad a sprain can be when you get it just right. And it was right after he got married to his second wife, and he sort of had one dad joke that, dads, once they find a joke they like, they will really drive it into the ground.
I don't know what you're talking about. I'm just kidding. I do that all the time.
He was like, oh, man, I can't argue with my wife now that I just got married because I don't have a leg to stand on.
Nah. Yeah, you got to use up that one.
Uh-huh.
Use it until it's gone. Ankle sprains are really bad. But nobody in the New York Knicks fandom took my experience spraining my ankle as a senior in college as a serious assessment of what Julius Randle would be like, what timetable would be set for him. They're like, well, he has all the best medicines. And I'm like, a ligament is a ligament. Like, we don't live in Star Trek worlds. Like, you still have to be in bed for a certain amount of time before it gets better, even if they're shooting cryo-freezing substances at your ankle or whatever they're
Yeah, and he doesn't have to
have.
recover enough to go back to an office job. He has to recover enough to be useful on a basketball
to be
court.
jumping and landing on it. And
Yeah, if they did put him back in, that would not have been something that lasted very long.
Yeah, he's not playing in the first round. It's very sad because the Knicks are having a magical season. And while they're playing well without him so far, like, theoretically they'll need their all-star at some point. Oh, well.
It's a team sport.
Very, very Knicksy. It is. Weirdly, they play better team basketball without him because he's sort of a ball stopper. Like, they give him the ball and he does his isolation, and he dribbles and takes a fadeaway shot, and he's great at those. But so without him, they play like the old like Princeton college team that went to the tournament. They're just like cutting and passing the ball around and sharing it, and they look great, but when you need that tough basket, that's when it gets hard.
Hey, man, the important thing is the friends they made along the way.
Yes. That sounds like an Optimus Prime life lesson to me.
And that's basically going to be the point of my movie, rather than an action sequence. Is just the main character is like, should I call my friend and ask for help? And they're like, hey, we're doing stuff together. Mm-hmm. Because that's a lot cheaper to shoot than action sequences.
Yeah, even though you theoretically could do all of the post-production yourself and just bill yourself on the movie.
I mean,
you don't feel like it.
Yeah, like, in theory, I could also try and star in a movie. If I'm directing it, nobody can tell me no. But
yeah,
that doesn't make it a good idea. You've acted with me.
I don't know. I thought we did some fun stuff. And then also, if the theme of the movie is just kind of corporate ennui, I think you could express that very well.
Expressing it as... I actually am going to have a cameo at Nobody's Anonymous as a person who hasn't yet made a movie.
Which is not true.
Hasn't yet made a feature film.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
Because at the point that scene is recorded, it will be true. Mm-hmm. I enjoy being very literal. It is that sort of programmer's mindset approach to art of, sure, we could tell a good story, but also we can be literally accurate.
Want to make sure that the credits are accurate, not lying to people. Okay. I think we did it, yeah?
Yeah.
Oh, we're good.
Okay. I was just going to stare awkwardly into the camera until the end. Thank you, George.